Thanks for coming to today's seminar. Today I'm very excited to have Dr. Rebecca French come here. Dr. French is the director of the Office of the Climate Planning. This is the new office from the commissioner. He's also the commissioner of the Connecticut Department for Energy and Environmental Protection, in short DEP. And her first charge is to administer the governor's Council on Climate Change, which is GC3. And previously, Dr. French served as the director of resilience for the city Department of Housing and as the director of community engagement for the Connecticut Institute of Resilience and Climate Adaptation into 2018. And Dr. French also spends a year in Congress as Congressional Science Fellow in the Office of U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders, and serving as a policy advisor to the senator in the areas of energy, environment, and agriculture. So it is our great pleasure for the senator to invite Dr. French here today to use about climate policy, especially for climate change mitigation policy in Canada.
Hi, everybody. The mask on. Can everyone hear me? Are the folks letting?
Yeah, the other
in? There's someone that didn't go, folks. Okay.
Yeah, Maura is online to have.
Okay, great. Okay. Oh, that was. Okay. So good afternoon. Very happy to be here. I'll be talking about policies that have been adopted, basically going out of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that council is. I'm definitely going to talk about mitigation. I'm also going to talk a little bit about adaptation and resilience. Council covers both areas. And then this brief presentation, also then happy to answer questions about this or about really anything related to my background or any curiosity you have about Connecticut. All right, there we go. Okay. So the Governor's Council on Climate Change is created through executive order from Governor Lamont. There was a Governor's Council on Climate Change under the previous governor, but it focused only on mitigation. Governor Lamont expanded it for the first time to include both carbon emissions reduction or mitigation and adaptation resilience. To the left is Governor Ned Lamont. To the right is Commissioner Katie Dykes. She's my boss. She's the head of the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. So again, had two objectives for this council from the governor. Monitor and report on the state's implementation of greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategies. We've been working on that in Connecticut for quite a while. And we haven't done as much on implementation and adaptation strategies. So we're developing a new plan in that area and assessing the impacts of climate change. And I come more from the resilience space. So when someone says mitigation to me, someone's like, are you talking about hazard mitigation, which is resilience? Or are you talking about mitigation, meaning reducing carbon emissions? So saying mitigation today, reducing emissions, stabilizing levels of heat trapped greenhouse gases. This is the quick snapshot slide of the Governor's Council on Climate Change process, where Buzzy was very much involved in this as a member of the Public Health and Safety Working Group, which was one of 7 working groups that did the lion's share of the work of the Governor's Council. There are 23 appointed members. So it's are appointed either because they are commissioners or the head of their agency. So there's 10 different agencies serving on the Governor's Council. The other half of the council is organization, non-governmental organizations, industry representatives, a municipality, and a council of government, which is Connecticut's equivalent kind of county government. We don't have county government technically. We have regional planning bodies called councils of governments. And but again, the working groups are really where we develop policy concepts, met, learned about all these different topic areas of mitigation, working natural lands, science, technology. equity, environmental justice, infrastructure and land use, public health and safety, and financing options for adaptation and resilience. Together, those working groups had about 231 people. They represented over 100 organizations, and they held 186 meetings, which is a little much, but this is in 2020. So they had just started meeting before the governor declared the stay-at-home emergency, public health emergency that sent everybody home from state government, and we went entirely online. And so I think that was kind of one of the interesting outgrowths of doing work in the pandemic. A lot of other people's jobs had kind of paused, and we actually had a lot of participation in these Zoom meetings from folks who were just working from home or not working at all, not able to work at all. The result of that huge effort was each working group produced an individual report with recommendations, overview of sort of issues, but also a list of recommendations for policies. And those policies were submitted to 23 members of the council, and together they made up this report with 61 actions, each of which have multiple parts. So it's really more around 200 recommendations. And we put this out in January 2021, was presented to the governor, and it's up to him to take action on whether he wanted to implement those recommendations. And so I'm going to talk about what happened as a result of those recommendations and things that were very closely related. Skipping around a little bit out of order, I'm going to talk about legislative passage, but I'm going to start kind of at the end of 2021. Governor decided to sign Executive Order 21-3. These are 23 actions to implement about 30 plus actions recommended by the Governor's Council on Climate Change. It used the equity lens that we incorporated into all recommendations were meant to be viewed through an equity lens. We had training on equity and environmental justice to help all the working groups make sure that was a key part of anything that they did, or at least evaluate that issue and how policy might impact it. It was informed by best available climate science. The report includes a summary of sort of key climate impacts Connecticut expects to face between now and 2050. And it took a whole of government approach. So often in Connecticut, people think the DEP does everything climate. Not so. We do a lot. So we're the energy and environment. We're one of the few, not the only, maybe one of the few states that combines their energy and environmental agencies into one single agency. And the main reason we did that in 2011 was because of climate, because climate branched both areas. But like I said, there's like 10 agencies involved in the Governor's Council on Climate Change: insurance, emergency management, Department of Public Health, Department of Transportation. I'm not gonna name any more, but we have lots of agencies in there. Each of them had a recommendation that related to what they do. So here's some examples from transportation from this Executive Order 21-3. It called for a statewide battery electric bus fleet by 2035, basically immediately directing DOT to cease purchasing any more diesel buses, which is what a lot of our buses were on today. So we're stopping that right now, and then the fleet will transition over the next 12 years to entirely electric. And also looking at our vehicle miles traveled reduction target and setting one. So this little graph over here is showing transportation is our largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Connecticut. Very consequently, it's also a major source of public health hazards. This city of Hartford that I just drove down from, the highest asthma capitals in the country. And they're on major transportation corridors. What's at the intersection of New Haven? 91 and 95. Everyone's driving gas-powered vehicle, and it's releasing a lot of particulate matter, NOx, ozone, not to mention carbon dioxide. So anyway, I know you know all that, but this is what's interesting. Even as transportation has become more fuel efficient, you'd expect emissions to go down. What's also been happening, however, is that our vehicle miles traveled is going up. that has offset and even exceeded the efficiency gains that we've made and our cars being able to drive longer on less fuel. So basically, unless you go 100% electric, in which case your vehicle miles traveled matter, just for other reasons they matter, but in terms of congestion, but they won't matter in terms of emissions. But while you're still driving gas, you need to reduce those vehicle miles traveled to keep offsetting your efficiency of having better transportation. We did see a drop with the pandemic in these numbers, but it's actually come back and then some. So you think maybe with more people working from home, doesn't really happen, just kind of habits changed, but we have actually not seen a major reduction in vehicle miles traveled. Still wrapping my head around that, but that's what the data says. I don't know exactly the why. That's how that's worked. This is then some snippets. This is another one from Department of Administrative Services. So our Department of Administrative Services in Connecticut is the one who leases all of our state buildings. They do our state vehicles that I just drove down in. So they really control the government's, most of the government's emissions and the decisions that they make for purchasing and construction. They do all of that. So we are looking at how we can adopt in our state buildings a retrofit plan for existing fossil fuel-based heating and cooling systems to be able to transition them to systems without carbon-emitting fuels. And then we're also going to look at all new construction and major renovations, targeting fiscal year 2024 and after. This is a major shift in state buildings and how we do that. The retrofit is going to be quite challenging. I think that's why we had this down to develop a plan, because it's such a monumental task that DAS is like, I can't really tell you what kind of a policy we should develop off the bat because we've never really looked at this very closely. So they're in the planning stage, and that plan should yield this is what we can actually do. These are targets that we can actually set for transitioning our existing building stock to being operated without carbon emitting fuels. New construction should be a little easier to do than retrofit. So again, our buildings are not, this is how much of a dent is this going to make in overall greenhouse gas emissions in the state. But probably somebody else knows the answer to that from the Greater Drug Project. But the main thing is it's leading by example. So the state is a big purchaser. We spend a lot of money because we can move the needle. We can advance technologies, can bring down prices for other people by our purchasing power. That's what lead by example can do. The federal government is doing similar things like this under the Biden administration. Another thing we did was establish the first Connecticut Equity and Environmental Justice Advisory Council, called CJAC. We love acronyms. This is to advise the commissioner of DEP. They have started meeting, and they're again just looking at issues within DEP, but this was related to some legislation that didn't pass, but there was a recommendations that called for a greater role and more formalized role for equity and environmental justice work within our agency, which Commissioner Dykes has really been a champion of since she became the commissioner and looking at this more closely. So you can find more information about who is serving on the CJAC. And all their meetings are open to the public. So if anybody is interested in attending a meeting and listening in, we're always welcome to do that. Okay, the executive order also called for, well, this is in statute, we have to do a comprehensive energy strategy, but it said that the comprehensive energy strategy should address these issues. Identify strategies to provide more affordable heating and cooling for Connecticut, reduce greenhouse gas emissions from buildings, and improve the resilience of the state's energy sector to extreme weather events, fuel commodity price spikes, and other disruptions. Remember, we wrote this in December 2021. It's before the Ukraine war. It's before everything going on with that. So this last part's become more important. But affordable heating and cooling is a very big issue. That's also being impacted by global events, and also just overall grid resilience. So This is a very high-level strategy report. It's being led by a new policy advisor, Becca Treach, who joined us a few months ago. This is ongoing right now. We had 2 technical sessions last week. I should show those technical sessions. So they're doing these sessions really to educate, largely in part, deep staff, but the general public as well. Though these are very technical sessions with like experts from Department of Energy, industry experts, academic experts, talking about all these different areas in a very technical way. But it's also going to lead into broader sort of policy concept development and listening sessions, sort of the impacts of energy issues. But we're looking very much at decarbonization, spending a lot of time on heat pumps, thermal, meaning heating and cooling, decarbonization, electric demand response, alternative fuels, natural gas planning and policies, which is a big deal, and carbon pricing and low carbon incentives. So it's a very tall order, broad high level report, but this should yield quite a few new recommendations. Onto some, this is another action from the executive order that we've implemented. This is more adaptation and resilience side of things. My office is actually taking the lead on this personally. This is the creation of a deep climate resilience fund, which is basically we have, especially with the passage, although we were going to do this before that bill passed in Congress. Now it's especially important that the bipartisan infrastructure law that was passed last spring. It's getting mixed up because Inflation Reduction Act also passed. So getting confused last year. And that had actually a huge amount of funding for resilience in that infrastructure law. Very strong bipartisan support for resilience, actually, because storms do not discriminate at all on where they hit. And there's broad agreement that who want to address that issue, even if they do not believe that it's caused by climate change or it's by climate change. So in Connecticut, again, we're seeing the very broad-based support for resilience funding. And this is going to help municipalities, community organizations do planning and also project development to make sure that we can actually help get more of that federal funding into Connecticut to do more projects. Things like some of the images you see here. This is Meriden, Connecticut. It's called the Meriden Green. It's actually a rail station over here. This area used to be an old mall and flooded all the time because the river brook that you see here was buried underground in a cement box. And every time there was a heavy rainstorm, that box would back up, and the flooding would back up because there wasn't enough space for the river to do what rivers need to do, which is actually flood. They're supposed to go over their banks. They have floodplains. Have anywhere to go, so it would back up. The sewer system caused all kinds of traffic back up into the mall. It's a brownfield site. Anyways, had all kinds of problems. So they took the river out of the cement box, made it a park, gave it a space to flood. So this is a park that floods when there's a storm. But by doing that, it changed the floodplain and allowed for additional economic development and redevelopment around the area that would have been flooded, but now does not flood anymore as a result of the creation of this park. And here's another solution, which is called the Living Shoreline. It's about basically using natural systems or akin to natural systems to mix. There's some rocks breaking up wave energy that can reduce erosion, and which is exacerbated by sea level rise. And here's just some examples of problems. These are houses that were damaged at Sandy that are right along the shoreline. And here's a very typical situation in Connecticut. Underpasses under our rail line, they inherently go lower so you can get the clearance. The first place that floods, this can actually cut off entire neighborhoods from evacuation routes. Very, very common. To the point where they actually, like, there's places in Branford that flood, like people time their commutes by it because they know they can't get onto the bridge today. That's happening today. Okay. We're also working to develop an environmental justice mapping tool. It's a very exciting project. We have a definition of environmental justice communities in Connecticut, which again is actually really unique. to Connecticut. Most states do not have any statutory definitions of what is an environmental justice community. It's making it very difficult for them to like figure out who to prioritize and why. That kind of debate within their legislatures. But our definition is largely about economics. And so we wanted to have a more comprehensive approach to this. This was a recommendation of the Equity Environmental Justice Working Group, and consequently led by former Yale professor Marian Engelman-Otto, who's now the head of the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA. Did not realize how big a deal she was when she was working with us. So it's been really exciting to be like, wow, our equity environmental justice recommendations were written by the new head of the EPA Office of Environmental Justice. That's really great. Feel really confident that we're doing some good stuff here. So this environmental justice mapping tool will incorporate health data. We'll come up look at environmental burden, a lot more factors that, in addition to income, which could influence a community's vulnerability to things like climate change, but to any issues. This is another closer to home program for you, the Urban Forestry Climate Equity Grant Program. These are pictures from the Urban Resources Initiative in New Haven, the tree planting initiative, which is, I think, in partnership with Yale School of Forestry. Excuse me, it's not called the Yale School of Forestry, Yale School of the Environment, formerly the Yale School of Forestry. We launched a pilot program that I hope will continue. I'm very confident it will continue to fund more tree planting and capacity building activities around the health and use of trees, which is really a growing solution for sort of the impacts of climate change, particularly related to heat. But trees do all kinds of good things. They increase property values. They mitigate stormwater flooding. So we're really pushing into this a lot more deeply, as deep. We just have one urban forester, but she's doing a lot of great work. So Yale grad. I didn't go to Yale, but the equity. We're also looking at equitable energy efficiency. So we do a lot of work in energy efficiency at DEEP. The best way to reduce emissions is to not use energy at all. So we have had energy efficiency funds. You pay a utility bill in Connecticut, you are paying in towards the energy efficiency fund for Connecticut. Those resources are used to subsidize technologies, subsidize home equity audits, home energy audits that go into people's homes and rental spaces and look at how they can reduce their energy use. But oftentimes those home energy audits can't result in actual putting in more energy efficient actions, because if there is any issue related to, say, there's asbestos in the home, or there's mold, or there's lead, any of those issues make the utilities will not do anything to that home to install energy efficiency improvements. So we launched a program using some of our recovery dollars, the weatherization barrier remediation program, and that's trying to address some of those issues, which are public health issues in and of themselves, indoor air quality, but they also mean that you can't work on energy efficiency until those are addressed. Okay. Put this one in here because we're also very happy that the Connecticut Department of Health received its first CDC BRACE grant, Building Resilience Against Climate Effects. This is a small program that CDC runs, but it's the only one focused exclusively on public health. I hope that the federal government continues to invest in this area. I think it's really important. I think public health at the intersection of climate is a really cutting edge area, so I'm really applaud all of you for being part of this program. And particularly in Connecticut, I think we've used public health as a major lens through which we see all of our work, which is unique as I've talked to other states. But this is basically a planning process of how you might look at public health issues at the intersection of climate. And it's going to provide some funding for director of this office to partner researchers. Again, Dr. Bozzi is one of the partners on this. So is the Connecticut Institute for Resilience and Climate Adaptation. And so more to come on this. More on mitigation. Okay, so switching back to more on mitigation stuff. We're also investing a lot in energy storage. So we've covered a lot of different kinds of ways you can lower emissions, building retrofits, decarbonization. Doing battery storage is actually also really important to our overall grid resilience and being able to balance this. As we transition to more and more renewables, especially rooftop solar, we're trying to get people who have that to also put in battery storage so that we have a place for energy to go when it's not used by them, or a way for the grid to store energy in a distributed way so that it can then be used to replace, for example, we have peaker plants in Connecticut. These peaker plants are when we have really high demand, it's a really cold day, it's a really hot day, really high demand for energy. That's when we actually turn on our dirtiest fuel sources, unfortunately. These tend to be diesel burning gas plants. I think one of them is located in New Haven. So we want to get away from using those peaker plants as much as possible. They're also very expensive. So if we can do more and more energy storage, that will help reduce the need for those peaker plants, because it'll allow us to just manage that grid energy, put it in a place where we want it, and then just release it when we need it on those peak storage days. And it can also be a resilience strategy, because these battery storage, if you're a homeowner or rental, it can be a backup power source for your building for at least a shorter amount of time. So this is like the incentive program that's ongoing. I think this has been very popular. Actually, I think it might be sold out at this point. So giving residential customers a $200 per kilowatt hour premium. Maximum project extent is $7,500. Very generous. We'll do the same for commercial industrial partners who are doing this. We're going to have performance incentive payments. Again, contributing that grid during critical periods. So we're trying to incentivize people to help us and be partners with us on building a more resilient grid. And we have additional incentives built in for low-income customers. So that's that equity lens being built into our programs. I'm not having this just be the same across the board, but making it more progressive programs. So this is a really long list. We did a lot. So the presentation is like, and we did this, and we did this, and we did this. This climate change adaptation, this was one of the recommendations. So now we're going to legislative wins. This passed in the 2021 year. This was the only major climate legislation that passed in 2021. Like I said, adaptation and resilience tends to be a little easier to pass. And this one allowed all municipalities in Connecticut to set up something called a stormwater authority, which basically allows them to set up a fee structure for dealing with the pollution and flooding related to stormwater. And examples of things you can do is put in bioswales. And municipalities are exploring this. We've seen another one pass. We have one in New London. We passed another one in New Britain, Connecticut. And in this Deep Climate Resilience Fund I'm working on, we see many municipalities tell us they're very interested in that. So we expect to fund some more planning projects around starting up stormwater authorities. It also expanded the Connecticut Green Bank, which is very famous for leveraging private dollars with a small amount of public dollars to get investment into the clean energy space. They now can establish an environmental infrastructure fund and work in the environmental space. I'm most interested in their work in adaptation and resilience, and working with them on that. And this also does something much more esoteric that is helpful to municipalities, but only if you're really in the weeds. It gives you additional authority to do. Municipalities had this thing called flood control boards. They now can have flood prevention, climate resilience, and erosion control boards. And it basically gives them kind of authority they need to build, fund, finance, maintain, operate any kind of climate resilience project. Which I'm not going to go into why that's important, but it's important to have those authorities. It's kind of like all the ducks in a row for this kind of stuff does get into like, what can a municipality do? What can the state do? What can a COG do? How do we figure out who can do what? How they work together? This is some additional outreach work that was done by It's been done by partner organizations to try to get more interest in stormwater authorities. It does appear to be working, which is great. Okay, now into the year 2022. So like I said, we basically just had a climate adaptation win in 2021. Going into 2022, one of the reasons the governor went through Executive Order 21-3 was he was trying to set a standard for the legislature, which was like, look, this is everything I can do as a governor. This is like maxes out my executive authority on pretty much everything related to climate. I can't do more than this without you telling me that I can do more than this, that my agencies that I oversee can do more than this. So you have to put some things in the statute. So you're able to pass what was has been an executive order, was in the executive order that created the Governor's Council on Climate Change. It's now a statute. So whoever's the next governor of Connecticut, which will be decided tomorrow, will still be subject to this, that we have to have all of our electricity supplied to our electric customers in Connecticut has to be from zero carbon emissions. That has to be done by the year 2040. We are already 65% of the way there with a mix of nuclear and renewable solar. By the time we bring on some major wind procurement, we've already done as a state, we'd be 91% carbon free in Connecticut, which is just amazing. So the 2040 goal is very much reachable. So this is very doable. People say like you can't do this. It's really, I mean, we're really very close to getting there already within a few years. So this is really excellent news, and I was very pleased to see, and very huge bipartisan support for this. Personal suspicion is because it does include nuclear, and a very powerful member of the state legislature lives in Waterford, Connecticut, where the nuclear power station is located. I used to live there. We also passed public education 1.4, that concerning clean energy tariff program. One of the things this did is it supported distributable energy generation that allows people who can't put solar on the roofs to buy into a centralized solar array like this one in Bloomfield, Connecticut. And this one is 1.62 megawatts of solar panels. And it provides energy savings to 50 customers who bought into this. So particularly if people can't put on their house, have too much shade, it's just not compatible, whatever reason, they can buy into an offsite solar installation and get the same benefits as someone who mounted on their own roof. This was the big one. Okay, so there's I'm not going to go into it too much because it's a long story, but we tried to pass in 2021 something called the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which was supported by Governor Lamont. So it was about basically trying to do what we do. We're part of something called the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative that trades carbon credits from our power sector, trying to do something very similar to that in the transportation sector. Did not pass. There's a quite a well-organized opposition to it, particularly from fossil fuel industry. So there was a lot of consternation about that not passing, both from the executive branch and from legislative champions of it. And so this act kind of grew out of that. The Transportation and Climate Initiative would have provided a sustainable source of funding to do a lot of good things, like have electric school buses, electric public transportation, more charging for electric vehicles. And so we decided to push that as much, or they, I should say, the legislative champions decided to push that as much as possible. And they did actually also look at Executive Order 21-3 for ideas from this. So some things I'm going to tell you were in Executive Order 21-3, and now they're in law as a result of this passing. So that's one of the ways that executive orders and legislative things can work together. Sometimes the executive branch can use an executive order, tee up policies, and the legislature will actually look at those. Oh, I like that too. Putting it in law now, so everybody has to do it, no matter who the governor is. This is a very short summary of everything this bill does. I think it was on your assigned reading list, so you can look more into everything this bill does. But a bill that was a bill introduced by the governor was incorporated into this bill that was championed by the chairs of the Environment Committee and the Transportation Committee. that Connecticut can adopt California's emission standards for medium and heavy duty vehicles. This is an efficiency standard. It's not zero carbon, but it's an efficiency standard that will really move the needle on some of our most heavily emitting journey vehicles, or meaning trucks, buses. It establishes grant programs for signal modernization, zero emission school buses, zero emission medium heavy duty trucks. So basically we're doing subsidies using state dollars, giving some property tax exemptions for zero emission buses and EV charging. We have an existing program for the acronym is CHEAPER. It's a rebate program. It's like on the hood rebates for electric vehicles or low emission vehicles. And so now it's going to incorporate incentives for people with low incomes, environmental justice residents. It's also going to include micromobility, like electric bicycles, for people who want to use those. It may not carve out high percentage of residents, at least in Hartford, do not own a car. And so we're realizing our program really wasn't serving them at all. So this is one of the ways we're helping it serve those communities if you're not using cars. Establishes right to charge for renters and unit owners in condominiums, common interest communities. I have people on my team who live in a condo and they're like, I really like to buy an EV. There's no place for me to charge it because I don't have a garage that I can plug it right in. I'm a single family homeowner. I can use my own garage. It's very easy for me to get an EV and have a way to charge it. And my research analyst Alanis can't do that right now. There's no EV charging in her building. So it's trying to fix that. And also just prohibiting, like, you can't say, no, we will never allow EV chargers. So this is a lot, and there's even like things in here that are not in here. I didn't even do this, but we have to convert all of our state fleet all to electric. That was codified into this law as well. So there's a few more things in here that I don't have on this list. And that was one of the for the executive order that was codified. It also expanded our commercially property assessed clean energy program. This is a little bit on the adaptation side, but also EVs. This program, which has been incredibly powerful in Connecticut, that allows commercial businesses to have a way to pay back investments they might make in putting renewables, solar arrays, for example, on their businesses. They now can use some of that payback money that results from bill savings from the energy side to also pay for resilience improvements. They can also use it to pay for EV charging. We got a bunch of state bond money and general fund money to support climate smart agriculture. There's a brand new grant program that'll be rolling out in about a week on this. That's going to help our state's farmers adopt climate smart practices that improve soil health and through water retention. So it's really important in Connecticut. It's a smaller agricultural industry, but we've been very heavily impacted by the climate impacts in Connecticut. Last summer, they were all flooded because we had all those big storms. This summer, their crops failed because they had drought. So we've had disaster declarations last summer and this summer for our crops, flooding and then drought. So it's really been heavily impacted no matter what the weather is. Definitely becoming a problem in a state that wasn't really known for being that much of a heavy swing in issues related to agriculture. And we're also, this is maybe going to scratch the beginning of the service. It's a little bit more focused on the resilience side of things, but looking at the potential for agriculture and forestry to do carbon sequestration and storage, and how that might play into our greenhouse gas inventory overall. And finally, highlighting that Connecticut has received a lot of attention from federal government. One way I know this is because we've been getting visits from a few agency heads. This is the head of the Department of Energy visiting UConn campus, talking about clean energy. This is the head of the Department of the Interior with Commissioner Dykes and Governor Lamont touring of our reserves along our coast that are owned by the Department of the Interior. And this is the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration coming down to visit us and talk about, we just established a research reserve that is going to be focused on climate resilience at the coastal areas. think that is the end of my presentation, but there's a lot more that I didn't cover that that's been done. Basically, just some massive effort, really inclusive of all aspects of things we do in climate in Connecticut. It's very interesting to listen to all the stakeholders and try to balance a lot of different needs, both for and against climate issues. And so I really encourage you to get involved in that. We have had students serve on those working groups. Or just even listen in. It's a great learning opportunity. It's really an excellent example of saying this is part of your government. Made this process very open. And particularly under Commissioner Dykes, so I think it kind of changed from, it was a little more tight and small under Malloy. And Commissioner Dykes has viewed it more as a much broader stakeholder engagement effort and getting more voices to the table on concept development. I think that has also resulted in this really process that you see there, because not all these bills were things that the governor put forward or state agencies who also do legislative proposals. Many of these things, like the climate smart agriculture, that was picked up by someone who was part of the working group. They brought it to a legislator and said, hey, the Governor's Council on Climate Change report recommended this. I think you should back it. It came out of the stakeholder process. I can point to all these people who support it. Governor supports it. All these agencies said they support it. And that made it really easy for the legislator, easier for the legislator to say, this is something that I should support too. When you have these kinds of reports and this kind of open process, it lowers the barrier for a legislator to know if this is something that they're going to get support for, if they, take the political risk of bringing it to the school and introducing it as a policy. This is also, I think, something that I didn't appreciate in federal government. At the state level government, in terms of passing laws, there's a lot more access and involvement, and there's a very close relationship between agencies and the committees. It's really different than when I worked in Congress. So it represents an opportunity to get much more closely involved than you might initially think if you're working at the state level. Sorry. So that's it. I'm happy to take any questions. I think we have the room left for another 15 minutes. Yeah,
thank you.
Just
All the students have submitted their questions.
it's the commission.
Yeah. So all the students have already submitted their questions, and I think you can ask for yourselves. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for coming to us and speak with us. I'm Minnie. I'm a grad student at Yale School of the Environment. I did the planting trees thing with you.
Great.
Yeah, so I see the mention about the waste management aspect. So I know there's like huge waste prices in Connecticut, especially like the waste to energy plant. They're closing. They're very old and aging. So especially the Harvard one has just closed like 2 months ago, like the Mira. So I wonder, and just for your for information, the waste are now, instead of burning them and turning into energy, they're now sent to out of state landfills in Ohio. So that costs a lot of taxpayer money, but also costs a lot of huge environmental impacts. And then also the NIMBY thing, like not in my backyard, they're sending all the waste to out of state, which is huge burdens to other states. So I feel like, why does a rich state like Connecticut have the right to throw trash to states that are less affluent? And is Connecticut planning to do anything about this? And I actually worked on turning municipal solid waste to sustainable aviation fuel in the past year. So to SAF, we also talked a little bit about SAF. So have you thought about this option? Because this could be potentially the solution to both problems, the wave and SAF problem. And just curious, is Connecticut doing anything on the waste part?
Yes. So The Office of Climate Planning, definitely we had a lot of recommendations about waste, and the mirror conversation definitely came up in the 2020 Governor's Council on Climate Change process. Another process that grew that kind of started in late 2020 was called the Sustainable Materials Management Council. And that brought together municipalities to talk about just this issue, particularly municipalities were going to be impacted by the closing of the mirror plant, which meant that all these municipalities had to find a plan for where they were going to send their waste. It's not only an environmental issue, it's also a huge expense issue for municipalities. So one of the things that we have done, and we do have a director who's looking at these policy issues and manages this. His name is James Elvis. Excellent. He's also a former legislator. So I'm speaking to things that James has talked about, and I'm happy to refer you to James, question to James as well. But one thing I do know that we just announced awardees for our pilot program to try to get more of our organic waste diverted out of the garbage pail and into digestion facilities, composting, because organic waste, food scraps, is the heaviest, and it's of course very wet. So our cost to municipalities is based on the weight of whatever they throw. So if you get your organics out of there, you can make a huge impact on the overall weight of what you're throwing out. Of course, regular recycling. So one of the approaches that we're taking is to try to divert as much out of that waste stream that goes that. Unfortunately, you are correct that these are going to landfills outside of the states. We don't have landfills operating in the states. Although I'm speaking a little bit outside of my area here, so that's what I'm referring to James before I talk more about that. So correct. But that's my understanding. We just don't have a landfill in Connecticut to send it to. So that's why it would be shipped out of state. But the responsibility we're trying to take is get as much out of that's being shipped as possible. Does not look like we'll be doing more for waste to energy. That doesn't seem very popular. Obviously, the mirror plant is closed, and that was a huge environmental justice issue that was highlighted by the communities there. I'm very happy to see it closed. They felt like, and there's quite evidence to show this, that Hartford's been overburdened by multiple plants and sources of pollution. So that why are they going to continue to be a host community? That's not going in that direction. So that's one of the things that we're doing right now. Again, it's a pilot scale. A lot more needs to be done to really take this on. But there's a lot of interested parties because, like I said, it's an environmental issue and it's a huge bottom line issue for towns that are always very concerned about raising costs on their residents. That's very property tax. Let me speak to that. Speaking from personal experience of my tax. Yeah.
Thanks. Any other questions? So, yeah, Carol.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the Clean Air Act and the right to charge portion of that act, and if there's any thoughts about revisions to it to make it more accessible for renters. Because right now there's a lot of burden of cost put on renters to go through that process.
Sorry, say the last part.
It seemed like there's a lot of burden on renters to fund that whole aspect of it.
I don't know right now of any efforts to sort of open back up the law. I think there were definitely concerns raised during the debate on the bill about how this would impact affordability for affordable housing, with that drive-up cost. So I think there's probably more on the programmatic side of the rollout is where we'll fix a lot of those issues. But I'm sorry I can't speak more to that. Again, there's folks who I can refer who are working on sort of the rollout of that program and how it might actually play out in real time. But a lot of times when these bills get passed and then it goes to the executive branch to implement them, there's a lot that we can do once we get down to the program side, because usually the language in the legislation is fairly broad. It gives the executive agency latitude to design the program where it's needed. And address, and we have stakeholder, and public comment processes to try to get at what is not working and what is working. And where do we need to just tweak things here and there. Very rarely does the legislature tell us very specifically how to do something. Using broad guidelines, and you figure it out at the staff level. I think I saw your hand first. And yours. Try to get to as many as I can.
I'm really inspired by the work that you're doing. So thank you, and thank you for being here. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about your career path.
Sure. My bio talked about where I went. I decided for my education that I wanted to do hardcore science. So I really asked me this the other day, like what did you study? Was it related to climate change? Not really. I was a chemist and still love chemistry. And I wanted to do benchtop chemistry. So I have a PhD in environmental chemistry, and I studied crystal growth and how contaminants move around systems. And but I still use some of that's actually very useful for carbon storage and sequestration, which is about how carbon moves around the soil. So as we dig into that question, I'm like, I can finally use my chemistry degree. But I knew I also wanted to go into policy. So there's the fellowships called the AAA Science and Technology Policy Fellowships. That's how I worked in Congress. I also worked for EPA for 2 years. And that helped transition me from a very academic training to understanding how policy works, understanding the science intersection. It's a big part of my work. We're a science agency now. I've always worked where science is important in all that we do. And we have to bring science to bear on all decisions every day at DEEP. So that's kind of where it was. And I was more drawn to climate adaptation than the energy sides in terms of my specialty in climate, because that was really grew out of being a kind of earth scientist that basically, like, we've known for a long time that greenhouse gases warm up the planet. So that question's been answered for a while. It's been in the policy realm for decades, and we just build more and more evidence. Yes, this happens. Yes, this happens. Yes, this happens. But on climate adaptation and resilience, it's a much more downscale issue. And so I got very interested in, like, what kinds of data do we need from a climate science perspective to build things to be more resilient. And that gets into things like, how much rain are we going to get? So how big should we build this culvert or this drain or this bioswale? That question from a science perspective has not been well answered. We're still on the cutting edge of that actual climate work. All right, questions. I'm trying to get everybody. So 1, 2, 3. I'll try to get everybody.
So I know that there's been a lot of information presented here. I'm curious how this is being translated to, like, citizens within Connecticut so that they're aware of these initiatives. And is it primarily through, like, advertising, or they're more like community level engagement, or like outside of the working groups and like participation in those?
Yeah, I mean, the process that I've been most involved in is the working groups. The good thing is that many of those working group members are part of larger organizations that have members, and they are talking about it with their members, which I find very helpful, because I feel like a lot of times people turn to me and say, can you tell everybody? And they're like, do you want me to tell everybody, or to do something? So I'm constantly like in that push and pull of like working and also telling. So it's really helpful to have other organizations say, you know what, we'll do some of the telling for you. We'll also communicate that to people that we have plugged into us. Sometimes it's their followers on social media, sometimes it's their mailing list. And so that is one of the ways that we get things out. But we rely a lot on stakeholder groups and informing them and having those people inform others. And we also do some local engagement. Like, for instance, last summer, my office partnered with some local community organizations in London and Groton and held a workshop. And we were directly there doing the communicating about things that were going on in Wisconsin climate change. It was excellent. And the best part about it is we made some really long-term relationships with the people that were on our planning committee. But about 30 people showed up. So it was a lot of effort to design a workshop for a very small number of people. But the planning process led to a lot of trust built between myself and my team, and some local leaders in both those communities. And now they're serving on our Council on Equity and Environmental Justice. So they wouldn't have been serving in there if I hadn't got to know them through that workshop. So this is an interesting balance. It's something I wrestle with every day in terms of what I should be spending my time on and allocating my team's time.
Hi, I'm wondering how you or how Connecticut settled on a definition for environmental justice community, and if it's applicable to other states or if it's like very Connecticut focused.
Yeah, my understanding of this history, it goes way back to the 90s when the EPA, under the Clinton administration, President Bill Clinton passed an executive order that was about environmental justice and public participation, and Connecticut was like one of the first states to be a part of that and passed in statute our definition of environmental justice and what constituted a public participation process for those environmental justice communities. So Connecticut was a really early adopter. Edith Pestana, who still works for DEP, is our Office of Environmental Justice Coordinator. We have an environmental justice. We've had it since that rule passed in the 90s. And she still works there, and it's kind of had a renewed focus, and we're growing that. I think we can expect to see sort of more on that. The legislation introduced last year didn't pass, but I would not be surprised to see that sort of come back again on how we might define that and understanding. Environmental justice and equity issues are having a moment nationally, to say the least. Yeah, so it really did grow out of the big sort of introduction of that effort nationally back then, and it was just decided by the legislature how to do that. And there was a lot of uniting. I think at that time it's been told to me, which is great to have folks who've been working at EPA since. I've been working at DEEP since the 90s. The past is knowledge on to me. Has been working there since 2020 on this history in the state. But one of the reasons that it looked at income as a major factor is that actually allowed us to look not just at sort of an overall distressed factor, but look at pockets of concentrated poverty in communities in Connecticut. You wouldn't normally expect that. Like there actually are pockets of concentrated poverty in Stanford, Greenwich, which is famously wealthy, right? So, but we actually do have some communities that just in that little area are disproportionately impacted. So.
Thank you.
Laura, I know we have to get out of the room. Well, Laura, I can answer your question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks everyone for coming on the